Good evening and welcome to you this evening to our TechFest Digital Festival 2021. This year, as you've gathered, we're again hosting our festival online due to ongoing current events, which seem like never ending. Who knew 2 years later we'd still be in this position? Anyway, let's move on. The feedback we received from last year's Digital Festival was so positive about being online, and it's opened up new possibilities for our audiences, meaning we're not restricted to just our local northeast corner of Scotland, and we can engage with people right across Scotland and beyond. As we know tonight, we have people from Canada, so that's fabulous. I get very excited by these things. Anyway, as ever, our thanks go to our joint principal sponsors, BP and Shell, and also Equinar, who are kindly sponsoring the digital public programme. As this is a webinar function on Zoom, all your cameras and microphones are off or muted. But if you do have any questions as we're going through the presentation tonight, then please do put anything in the chat box or the Q&A box, and we will ask the questions and hopefully get answers at the end of the talk. So without any further ado, I'm delighted to welcome Lucina Hackman from Dundee University and the Leverhulme Foundation for Research. I think I got that in the right order, this evening, who's going to talk to us about forensic science, which I'm sure will be really fascinating. Love this kind of stuff. So over to you, Lucina.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that introduction, and welcome everybody this evening. So what I'm going to do this evening is I'm going to just talk a little bit about who I am, what I do. I'm going to then talk a little bit about a recent podcast that we created at the Leverhulme Research Centre that was based on a cold case, local cold case, and talk about the sort of ways in which we were looking at it and what we were thinking when we were creating that podcast. And then I'm going to talk a little bit at some point about forensic anthropology, which is what I do as a forensic scientist, and how that's changed even in the time that I've been working in the field. Please do ask any questions. I don't mind if it's on the podcast or on forensic anthropology itself, either, whatever you're interested in. And as I say, I will try and do my best to answer your questions as fully as I can once I've finished speaking and going through this presentation. I've not got a presentation to put up for a number of reasons, not least of which I don't use Zoom very often. So the technicalities of it overwhelm me, but I will just be talking about what it is that I do. So I'm a forensic anthropologist. I'm a professor of forensic anthropologist based at the Leverhulme Research Centre for Forensic Science at the University of Dundee. And I was previously at the Centre for Human Identification in the same university. So I've been a practicing forensic anthropologist for now going on about 14 years. It seems like longer, it's about 14 years since I've been at the university. I got my PhD at the university, and I'm an academic as well as a practitioner. So that means that I teach, I do research, and I go and do casework with police and with whoever is needing our skill set. So as a forensic anthropologist, how did I get into forensic anthropology? I'll talk about how I got into forensic anthropology in a second once I talk about what a forensic anthropologist does. So what does a forensic anthropologist do? We're about the identification of the human in medico-legal situations, as much as it's probably a very simplistic way to put it. But our key work is about identification. So we help to identify people who are unidentified, usually after, and commonly after things like mass fatality events or situations like a lot of forensic anthropologists work out in Argentina, Kosovo, Bosnia, where we're helping to identify those that have fallen victims to war crimes or within war situations. Many of you will have remember what happened in Bosnia, where you found the mass graves. They're still being found and the victims are still being identified. And what we can do as forensic anthropologists is we look at the skeleton of the individual. So we're anatomists, but we're very specialized anatomists. So we specialize in looking at the skeleton, and we can tell some things about people from their skeleton. We can start to look at their population that they originated from. We can look at the age they were when they died. We can look at whether they're male or female. All of these things help to create what's known as a biological profile, which helps to the police or whoever is doing the investigation to start to narrow down who that person might have been. We can also look at the skeleton to see if there's any features that that would help to individualize people, to actually say, you know, did somebody have a fracture when they were alive? Did they have a fractured femur, for example, that healed? Quite often, these things are pinned, for example, and we can start to use those pinning and compare them to radiographs that existed when people were alive. We can start to use those to help to individualize people. So we can actually start to give the police information on who that person was when they were alive. That is probably the core work that we do. Now, when forensic anthropologists started out, that was all they really did. Today, more commonly, we're also involved in things like analysis of trauma. So if somebody suffered trauma, whether they were suffered blunt force trauma or were shot, things like that, we can start to have a look at their injuries and to help the police and the pathologists in understanding what happened, because bony injuries can be quite different from soft tissue injuries. So we can help with trauma analysis, and we can also help with the time since death interval. So we can help to estimate how long it is since somebody died. So that's what we do as forensic anthropologists. And how I got into forensic anthropology, this is my second career. I was a nurse previously. I was a nurse for many years, and I went and worked in Albania for a time with children with disabilities. And whilst I was out there, the British forensic team was in Kosovo working to help identify victims of the Kosovan crisis. And I managed to get an invitation to spend some time with the British forensic team who were in Pristina at the time, and met who's now Professor, she wasn't at the time, Professor Sue Black, and decided that actually this looked like an interesting career, and came back to the UK from Albania and went back to university, and the rest is history. And then I came up to work in Dundee. So that's really how I got into forensic anthropology, and that's what a forensic anthropologist does. Now, as forensic anthropologists, we're quite low tech. We don't use high tech equipment. We're about understanding the anatomy of the individual, but in relation to those skeletal things that we're looking at within the skeleton. Although, obviously, anatomically, we're all one. So our soft tissue, our muscles impact on the skeleton, how we live our lives impact on our skeleton, and all of those are the things that we read when we're looking at the bones and the skeleton of an individual. So what we're doing in Leverhulme and the Leverhulme Centre is we're looking at forensic science, but looking at the science that lies underneath forensic science. Now, as a forensic anthropologist, we have a long history of science in forensic anthropology because we're based in anatomy. We're based on the use of anatomy in understanding the human body and understanding the skeleton. We have this long history that goes back a number of centuries and has a long history of research. Not all forensic science has quite the same history and has quite the same longevity. In reality, as forensic anthropologists, we're quite new to the field of forensic work, but we have that anatomical background and that anatomical understanding on which we can draw on when we're undertaking our analyses. So the Leverhulme Centre is about increasing that understanding and the science underneath forensic sciences. Now, forensic sciences, when we talk about forensic sciences, we're talking about a lot of different sciences. So I'm a forensic scientist, but I'm a specialised forensic scientist. But you can get forensic biologists, forensic chemists, all of whom look at specific areas. And it's about bringing in that science to the medical legal domain. And that's what we're doing in the Leverhulme Centre. But as part of that, we're also looking to try and understand how things have changed and understand how things have moved on. And we looked at, decided to look at a cold case based in Broughty Ferry, local to Dundee, that allowed us to understand the changes that have happened in the last 100 or so years in relation to forensic science and the way that we would undertake forensic science today. A little bit of background on the podcast. This is a cold case and one of the longest running cold cases in Scotland. Jean Milne was 69, she was unmarried, and she lived alone. She had a good income, but she was very independent. Okay, she lived life to the full. She travelled to Dundee regularly at the time. Broughty Ferry was separate from Dundee. You had to travel by tram between the two. And she also travelled to London as well. So she had a good income, so she was able to afford to do so. She was known as being independent, and she was known as being fearless. A little bit of an eccentric. She was understood to be that, although she was described as being church-going, but a little bit of a different person. In 100 years ago, females and women weren't quite as independent as they are today. So what we wanted to do in relation to the podcast was to understand something about Jean Milne, because the more we read about her, the more we wanted to understand who she was, and also understand how and look at how we would, if the same circumstances happened today, how the same crime would have been committed. But we didn't want to lose sight of Jean, because she wasn't just a victim, she was a person who was living life to the full. So just a little bit of history. On the 2nd of November in 1912, a postman tried to deliver some letters to Jean at her house and was unable to do so because her letterbox hadn't been emptied. Right? He was quite concerned about that, so he reported the issue to the police, who decided to get into a house to see what might be the problem. They broke into the house and found Jean lying at the bottom of the stairs. There's no sign of forced entry, but she was lying at the bottom of the stairs. She was deceased. Her legs were tied together and she had been beaten. And I would encourage you to listen to the podcast to have the full description of what occurred. The local police, realising that they needed to be assisted, brought in a police officer from Glasgow, a Detective Lieutenant John Trench, to assist them in the investigation of what had happened to Jean. Now, when we looked at this in relation to it being a cold case, in relation to it being in the past, it was very clear that the police had done what they could at the time. They'd actually took fingerprints were taken, they photographed the scene, they mapped the scene. Jean went for a post-mortem at Dundee. So they did what they could and knew what they had to do at the time. And they interviewed a lot of people. They worked really hard to try and solve the case. Now, Jean had last been seen when they started to interview all of the people, local people who might have recognised or have seen her around. She was last actually seen on about the 14th of October. And the date, she was not seen for definite after that date. A man had been seen around the property in the days after the 14th of October. And that was really important in relation to the investigations that the police undertook. After undertaking all of the interviews, they travelled to London. They didn't leave many stones unturned. As they found pieces of information, they followed that information up. In the end, they did arrest somebody, a Canadian known as Charles Warner. He was identified, a photo of him was identified by those witnesses that had been interviewed by the police, but there was no other evidence really in relation to him, and he had an alibi. So in the end, he was released and there were no further arrests. And as I say, the case remains a cold case. As I say, this is one of the oldest unsolved cases in Scotland. We didn't want to solve it. I mean, I think having been involved in a number of cold cases over the years, and I have been involved in a couple, memories soon go. So when we're talking about even cases that are, and the cold cases that I've been involved in are 40 to 50 years in the past, and 160 years in the past, memories change. Memories are not the same as they were at the time. People do their best to help, but that's just not possible for them to remember everything. Plus, obviously, this was over 100 years ago, so many of those people will be, and most of the people will be deceased. We didn't want to cause upset, really, as well, to the families that would still be left. But what we wanted to understand is how forensic science has evolved and changed in relation to the investigation of crimes of this time. And we wanted to know if there was more about the social surroundings of the time. So I think, having spoken to police and worked with police, one of the things that they're very interested in is getting to know the victim, because by getting to know the victim and how they spend their time and what it is that they do and who their relatives are and who their Social contacts are understanding the victim helps them to understand the crime often and to solve the crime. But Jean was a living person who had interests in life, and we wanted to understand the social surroundings of that time. And I think the podcast covers that really nicely. As a forensic anthropologist, obviously, I'm not a forensic, I don't do forensic biology and I don't do forensic chemistry, but we were looking at different specialists who would be involved. We brought them in, those that would have those specialist areas. And it's really interesting when we're looking at a crime like this, because we're looking, today we've got things such as DNA that we can use that would never have been even thought of at the time. DNA, even for us, is actually a relative newcomer to forensic science and to the solving of crimes. The first case that was solved using DNA was in 1987. In the end, involved a trawl by Leicester Constabulary of over about 5,000 people, 5,000 men in over a 6-month period, in which they were testing out this new science, if you like. And in the end, Colin Pitchfork was arrested for a crime of rape and murder. He was the first person to be found guilty as a result, and using DNA as an evidence. But 1987 wasn't that long ago, but today DNA is used commonly in solving of crimes. Things like fingerprints, however, and the use of fingerprints as identifiers have been around for much longer. And we have a long periods of time in which, over a century, in which fingerprints have been used to help identify perpetrators. And fingerprints analysis was attempted at the house of Jean Milne after her body was found. Unfortunately, they weren't able to find good fingerprints that they were able to use, which was a shame, but they did have a go at trying to do that. So some things haven't changed a great deal. Fingerprints and using, lifting fingerprints and comparing them to help identify people, that's still being used, but new processes have been brought in, such as DNA. And the way we would image a scene as well. So when we're working, photographs were taken at the time, over 100 years ago. But today, digital images would be taken, and we would take, often hundreds of images are taken of a scene and during an investigation, because we can take as many as we want, and we can keep taking those images, because those images give us a complete record of exactly how the scene was before we enter it, before we change it. Because any time that we do an investigation and enter a scene, we are going to change that scene, and everything that we do is going to make changes. Probably one of the things that would be used and has been brought in is the use of imaging. And I think this is one of the things I was asked about before I started this, is how has forensic anthropology changed even in the time that I've been working within forensic anthropology. And forensic anthropology, as I've said, is a really low-tech process. So it is about our knowledge of anatomy and our knowledge of the skeleton. And much research was done in the past, and that research is still being used to this day because it was sound and solid research that was done. But one of the things that has really changed for us as forensic anthropology is the use of imaging of the bodies and of the human anatomy. We know that radiographs, X-rays have been around for a long time and have been used for imaging, but things like CT and MRI, those two now have been really introduced and have been really useful for us as forensic anthropologists. And I know that many forensic pathologists also use CT to a great extent, because what we can do with CT is we can actually image the whole body, and we can have that there. That image gives us a snapshot of what the body's like before we do anything with it. And we can give us so much information, because a good CT image can give you everything that you need in relation to imaging. So for me and forensic anthropology, probably CT imaging would be the thing that has really made changes. It gives you a 3D image. It is still only an image of the skeleton, but it is a good image and it is a good record to keep. So when we were looking at what has happened with Jean, we were able to get hold of the transcripts and the transcripts of the interviews and that the police had done when they were interviewing people and potential witnesses. And it was fascinating to see how seriously the police took the case and how seriously they did, how hard they worked to track down witnesses. They travelled to London, they followed up, which wasn't as easy as it is today, followed up information they're able to get. And that probably for me hasn't changed a great deal. And I think probably that the way that they work hasn't changed a great deal. For them, it's about finding those clues, as it were, following that up, speaking to people, speaking to witnesses and potential witnesses. As a forensic anthropologist, as a newcomer on the block, as it were, I often have to work and do work with the police. I also work in other areas as well, but we can only work and assist in certain areas. So we'll help if there's a lack of identification, if they find an individual that's not identifiable. And we also work in those mass fatality situations where something like the London bombings, the Twin Towers in America, forensic anthropologists were at the forefront of those, identifying the victims there in both situations. So I think probably when we're looking at this and we're talking about forensic anthropology and we're talking about forensic anthropology in these different situations, I probably wouldn't have been involved in the case, in Jean Milne's case. I might have been asked by the forensic pathologist if they had any questions about any trauma that she'd suffered. But on the whole, it would have been a case that they would have done. But I could have helped, as I say, with the trauma analysis if it had been needed. I think when we're looking at something like this, and we're obviously the victim, and it's always about the victim in these situations, it's always interesting to see how everybody would come together. And one of the things that's really important today, and one of the things that's probably changed a great deal while we're still led, and the police and the Procurator Fiscal lead how the investigation goes, we come together as a team, and it's much more multidisciplinary than it was in the past. So you would probably have in these sorts of situations, and I think this is about because we've got these specialisms that didn't exist: DNA, blood pattern analysis, analysis involving different types of fingerprints, and we can lift fingerprints that we couldn't find in the past. All of these different areas, we come together in a multidisciplinary way. So you would not just have one person going in and recording, but we would have a whole team going in, all of whom would assist with trying to gather as much evidence as they could to try and assist the police in their investigation, to try and assist and find out exactly what happened in this. Now I'm going to leave it there. I've given you a very whistle-stop tour of what we do as forensic anthropologists and a whistle-stop tour of the podcast and exactly why we did the podcast and where we're sitting in relation to what it tries to look at. I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody has, not only in relation to the podcast for those that may have listened to it, but also in relation to what it is that we actually do as forensic anthropologists.
Cool, that was really interesting. I've got a question. Do you think that case will ever get solved, or is it just too far in the past now?
I think it probably is too far in the past, if I'm honest. I think because you're talking over 100 years in relation to that. So you've got, you haven't got, people won't remember. There's nobody around.
Your witnesses have gone, haven't they? Yeah.
Yes, your witnesses have gone. And all the information, whilst we've got transcripts, I suspect we probably haven't got the original information that we had. And even if you have, so this is what happens is that even if you have, and DNA was collected, for example, or fluids that were collected that could be tested for DNA, you've got nobody to compare that DNA to. Yeah. So it's not in the public interest. And I think that's really how the procurators work when they're looking at this, is it in the public interest? And at the time it's not. So unfortunately, probably not, but good question. Yes.
Oh, thank you. I suppose, yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? If it's too far, I mean, even like 30, 40 years ago, it's getting to the stage that you're running out of people who were there at the time or can remember clearly, or,
yes.
You know.
Yes, and I found that when I've worked on cold cases, I've worked a number of cold cases with the police. And one of the things that happens in Scotland is that cold cases are revisited. so that the police have these cases that are outstanding, and they will periodically revisit them to see if there's any new information that's come up, or if there are new techniques or processes that can be applied to the evidence that was collected at the time. I think that's a really good thing. But it does mean that memories, so unless you've got something like you've got a body fluid that you can test with a new method, then your reliance on on eyewitnesses and things like that just does cause a problem, understandably. I mean, I don't know about anybody who's listening, but I have difficulty. Somebody asked me today what I had for dinner last night, and I had to think for a minute or two. So if my memory can't last that long,
yeah, 30, 40 years is
yes, exactly, it does become.
Okay, Ollie is asking a question. He's saying, who are you employed by, if you don't mind me asking? Is it a police force or an external provider?
So I'm employed by neither a police force nor an external provider. I'm employed by the University of Dundee. They're the ones that pay my wage. Okay. I think they know that. Hopefully they know they're paying my wage, but they are paying my wage. Okay. So, but what happens is that I do a consultant. So the police will call if they've got a situation where they think a forensic anthropologist can be of assistance. Sometimes we can't, but they'll give me a call and say, we've got this has happened. Are you able to help? And then I go and work for them, and they will pay the university for the time I put into the case. Now, down in England and Wales, that would be slightly different, but there are a number of people that still work for universities. Slightly different up here in Scotland. Because we're so specialist as forensic anthropologists, up here in Scotland, it's not a large country. There probably isn't full-time employment for a forensic anthropologist. So
that's quite reassuring to know, actually.
so yes, I'm hired out, basically. So I'm a hire anthro, basically.
Somebody else is asking, are there other ways to get involved in the field without having to become a full-fledged forensic anthropologist?
Are there any ways to get involved in the field without becoming a full-fledged forensic anthropologist? Do you mean in relation to forensic science? I mean, I think it's very difficult. I think we have to, there's two ways in which we work as forensic anthropologists. If we're working in a forensic situation where you do have an actual inquiry, where you have somebody that has committed a crime, you're collecting the evidence and that is going to go to court, then I think we have to, you have to be a full-fledged forensic anthropologist. Okay, you have to, that has to be taken extremely seriously, because we have to get it right, or as correct as we can get it. So when you're talking about something like that, we do take what we do very seriously, and I wouldn't, we have a process in the UK, Scotland and England and Wales and Northern Ireland, where we can actually be certified. I'm a chartered forensic anthropologist with our professional body, for example, because that is a serious thing. We need to be able to stand up in court and be able to prove our expertise and demonstrate that we have the expertise that we claim to have. When we're talking about other things, such as working to recover the disappeared, which happens in many countries, South America's got, many of the South American countries, Argentina looks to recover the disappeared. Spain is another country that they're looking to recover the disappeared. There are ways that you can, if you've got a level of osteological knowledge, you can go and help and assist as volunteers in relation to that, but you wouldn't be at the forefront. You would be assisting and describing, because that is about a humanitarian recovery. So the difference there is that you're actually and many of these countries have actually specified that they're not going to look for perpetrators in the disappeared. They're actually only doing the recoveries so that they can return people to their families. And you have families who have, I mean, last time I went out to Pristina, I spoke to somebody, and that's a couple of years ago, who hadn't seen a brother for 19 years. He'd left the house and never come back. You know, so it's about the returning those family members to their families who don't know what's happened to them. And in those cases, you have a lead forensic anthropologist, but you'll have other people assisting who maybe don't have exactly the same skill set, but have enough skills to be able to assist. That was a rather long answer to your question, but hopefully it did.
No, I think that'll do. Okay, so Stevie from the NCA.
Hi, Stevie.
Says, always a pleasure to work with you, so presumably you know him. 2 questions. Are there any improvements the police could make in managing those scenes that you might become involved in? And do you have any processes in place to manage well-being for you and your staff following the traumatic scenes you're often involved in?
So in my experience here in Scotland, and I have worked in the past in England and Wales, but I'll talk mainly about Scotland because I think that's where I do most of my work now. Most of the time we have the chance to talk before we go to the scene. So there'll be a forensic strategy meeting, everybody will come together, and in my experience, that is really collegiate, to use a term. Everybody works together because everybody wants to get the most and the most that they can get. So I would say that most of the time no. Are there any improvements? Those improvements can be discussed before we do the work. And I think that's a really positive thing that happens, is that coming together of everybody, not just myself, but other specialists, the scenes of crime examiners, forensic pathologists, the police themselves, and fiscal sometimes. Coming together and having that discussion is so important about how we take things forwards. And sometimes we'll stop and take stock and have another meeting. So those meetings are absolutely so important to what we're doing. Have we got any process in place to manage well-being for you and your staff following the traumatic scenes you're often involved in? So I think that's a really difficult question. We do have university counselling and things like that. I think one of the things that I've experienced in my life, because I was a nurse and because I worked as a nurse before, you learn how to manage and to compartmentalise things. And I think that really prepared me for what I do now, because it gave you that ability to work and then to go home and not take work home with you, and to move on with the rest of your life. And I know that sounds, I think many people, it's not just in nursing, but in the medics, the police themselves, all of us, we learn to do that. And having done the nursing, that was a really important part of that. Saying that, I'm really careful with the forensic anthropologists, the junior forensic anthropologists that I work with and that I mentor, because I am aware that we are, there's potential for us to be, you never know when something's going to become stressful. So yes, we have counselling within the university that we can access and are able to access if we need it. But as I say, I think my nursing days, and I think as well, one of the things that was is difficult as a nurse, and I don't know if anybody's listening as a nurse, you're dealing with people at the most stressful time of their life. You're also dealing and helping to deal with their families as well. So you're working with the families as well as people who are, going through whatever they're going through. And I think, that the ability to do that is a really good lesson and a really good learning curve for you.
Cool. Somebody else is asking, what new scientific developments are going to help forensic anthropologists in the future?
Oh, good question. That's a really good question. I mean, we're so low tech as forensic anthropologists. We're so low tech that and anatomy is hugely researched area. As I say, for us, CT was a big change. What's going to help us? There's a number of holy grails going forward. Interestingly enough, DNA has been a help for us as well. DNA helps. It's not possible, for example, to assign a male or female to children because they haven't yet gone through puberty. You have to have that flood of hormones for the sexual dimorphism to occur within the human skeleton so that you can tell the difference between males and females. DNA has allowed us to now be able to do that with children. I don't know. I think it would be, I don't know, because that's in the future, isn't it? And that's one of the difficult things. I think probably would be about knowing more about how and finding a way that we could actually understand and have a study, some way that we could put a chip in us that understood how we live our lives and how exactly that influences our lives. Because one of the problems we have is that all of us live our lives differently. So because we live our lives differently, the changes to our skeleton, whilst they occur for all of us, they can sometimes occur quicker for other people. So for example, if you jog, then that causes quite a lot of stress to your lower skeleton and to the parts of the skeleton that we use for age estimation. So that can actually impact how those areas of the body look and that part of the skeleton looks. So when we give an age, look at an age, we can't actually say somebody was 47 years, 6 months, 3 weeks and 2 days old, because we have to allow for the fact that they may have jogged or they may not have jogged. So we have to give an age range, we have to give that range. So it would be really cool if we could have a chip implanted at birth that recorded all the changes and all the things that we did, so we could look back and understand how that actual person, and that would need to be somewhere that we could then recover it, obviously, and have a look, and we could understand how somebody lived their life and how that affected skeleton. That's really good.
Yeah, I'm not sure how the liberal people would go for
No,
that one.
no, actually, I agree, and it's not something I'm advocating for, but scientific development, that understanding, that closer understanding about how we live our lives and exactly what we've done, so we can understand the changes that have occurred.
So does, depending on like deep sea divers or spacemen, when they go up into space, something shrinks, the skeleton shrinks.
Yeah.
So would you need to know that, or could you work that out just from looking at a body if they've been into space or deep underwater, or?
So there's another number of things. So we all shrink as we get older. So we do allow for that. So what we would do when we're undertaking our biological analysis, we look at things in a certain order. So the population affinity affects the way that we assess the male or female part, and then that affects how we do and assess age, because males and females age at a slightly different rate. We go through all the same changes, but we go through those changes at a different rate through time. So, and then we do look at stature and we measure stature. And if we know that somebody is in the older age range, we know they've shrunk anyway. So we would take that into account, and we give stature as a range. We're pretty good at and quite accurate at assessing stature, but it's still within a couple of inches either way. If you go up in space, you don't just lose height, but you lose bone mass. So your bones would be much thinner than I would expect. So almost like elderly people with the osteoporosis, that's what occurs in weightlessness, where you're not walking around in gravity, then you lose that. So I would expect and identify the fact you've got osteoporotic bones that I wouldn't expect in somebody of your age, and then that would start to raise some questions. I don't know that we have that many astronauts around, but that would be the sort of things that I would expect to see. So you would expect to see, you could do the age and then say, right, okay, I've got bones that don't look correct for this age, and why are they not looking correct for this age? And that would be fed back to the investigative team and say, right, okay, so we've got thinning of the bones of somebody that I wouldn't expect thinning of the bones for. I would not necessarily and automatically expect them to be astronauts, but I would give reasons why they may have had those thinner bones. And there's a number of different reasons why it might have occurred, but all that can be investigated and looked at.
Okay, that's good. I just wondered.
Good question. They're all good questions.
I'm not sure if we've got any more questions or not, actually. I think that's us. If anybody's got a last minute one they want to put in. I was going to say, this sounds really bad. What's the biggest forensic anthropological, can't even say it, investigation you've been involved in? Is it?
I don't know. I was involved in the search for I can't remember her name, it's gone out of my head. I was involved in the search for Rennie McRae, for example.
Oh, the Inverness lady.
Yeah. We've been involved. It's cold cases tend to be the bigger ones. We had to assist with searching Monklands Canal a number of years ago. in a cold case search. Probably the largest ones are the searches for the missing and the disappeared. So Pristina. So when I went over there to assist a little bit with that, those are enormous, because when you've got disappeared, whether it's a result of war or whether it's a result of whatever has happened within a country, you're looking at missing in terms of thousands. And you've got what you've got is potentially thousands of missing people, but you've got a mass grave that's got hundreds in, and then you have to try and make those matches. And what you've got is a situation where those people in the mass grave could be any one of those number of missing persons. So they're the biggest, really, is those mass fatality events, but especially the situations have disappeared. So I have colleagues that work regularly over in Spain, because that's still in living memory, with the disappeared in Spain with the Spanish Civil War, and colleagues that work, say, in places like Argentina, where they're still recovering and identifying. Guatemala's another country where you've got that. It tends to be countries, though, where they've got they've decided to move on and to identify their disappeared, but not to bring in any judicial or processes where they're going to look for perpetrators.
Okay, cool. Right. I think, okay, so somebody's saying,
who would you
can you see that?
Who would I like to play me? Oh, I don't know. I tell you what, I'm going to ask you to suggest who you'd like to play me. I don't know. I've not really ever thought of that. There's a big interest in dramas about forensic situations. But who would I like to play? Oh, I've always had a thing for Helen Mirren, because I think she's so cool. But I'm happy for you to suggest, any of you to suggest who you'd like to play me. But I just think Helen Mirren is cool.
She is very good, to be fair. Maybe a bit too old for you, though.
Maybe.
Meryl Streep.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
Maybe that's just a hair colour.
She's got an American accent, so I'd probably have to. And I don't know. Would they have to have, as I'm working up here in Scotland, would they have to have a Scottish accent? Really, I don't know.
Oh no! Now you're going into too much detail, I think.
Indeed.
So what about all the dramas, the CSIs and all that? I mean, you must get a lot of people. Does it really happen like that? And
yes,
kind of like,
yes.
Yeah.
So I have no, and I've been asked about these, and in books as well, where they've got there's a number of series that have forensic anthropologists in, but the CSI, the NCIS, and things like that, they're fiction. So that their Bones is another one, isn't it? I watched that once and thought it was awful. But I don't personally watch it, because the trouble is, because it's fiction, then there are things in there that are incorrect and say by definition fictional, and you have to suspend belief a number of times. I think they have opened up and people's understanding a little bit to the fact that forensic science and what it does and what the role it can play. But the bottom line is it's a fictional, it's a story. It's not based on reality, or loosely based on reality. So I have no problem with them personally, so long as people understand that they are fiction, and that most of the things that they do on CSI, not only can we do it, we can do some of them, not only but others we can't, but certainly we don't look that glamorous while we're doing it. So no, I don't.
Solve it in an hour.
It's not over in an hour. These things are long running and take a lot of time and a lot of work. Plus, also, we don't, as forensic scientists, all we're doing is the bit that we do. So when you see many of these dramas, the forensic scientists go out and they've all got a gun, haven't they? I don't get given a gun. I'm probably safe if I'm not, but they go out and solve the crime. I don't go out and solve the crime. We are part of a jigsaw. We are part of a whole team that helps to try and get as much information as can be got, and it's the police that do the work and bring it together and to as I say, solve it and to do it. We don't, as forensic scientists, we're just part of that team, and we're part of the jigsaw that comes about. Yes.
Oh, that's a shame that Helen Mirren's maybe missed her chance. But you can have a wish list. That's okay. Okay, I think that's the end of the questions now. So maybe just have to to leave it there, I think. But that was really interesting. Thank you. And thanks to the audience as well for putting in the questions, because they were interesting too. Yeah, so thank you everybody for attending this evening. And if nobody else has got any other questions, then we'll stop there, I think. But please remember that we are going until the 1st of December, so we have a couple more weeks of interesting talks and presentations in the evenings for you. And this talk has been recorded, so it will be on our YouTube channel soon. I'm not saying it'll be tomorrow, but it might be in the next couple of days. But no, that was really good. Thank you so much for giving up your time this evening.
Thank you very much.
Oh, a few thank yous coming in there. So
thank you. And thank you everybody for attending and listening.
Yeah, no, that was really good. Excellent.